Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we dig into stacks of source material, all the facts, the interviews, the history, and really try to pull out the insights, go deeper than just the surface stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And today we are diving deep into the career and, the pretty personal journey of a comedian who really walks this line between incredible talent and just profound vulnerability. We're talking about Todd Glass.
Yeah, and the source material we have here, it's really rich. We're looking at a career that goes back decades. I mean, starting way back in 1982, and he's still going strong today.
40 years, basically.
Exactly. And what's really interesting, I think, is how the sources track not just, the career ups and downs across stand-up, TV, podcasting, but how it's all tangled up with these two huge, very public moments in his life.
Right, the health crisis and coming out.
Yeah, the heart attack, which was incredibly serious, and then later coming out publicly. And the sources really suggest these weren't just side notes. They actually became central fuel for his comedy, for that specific kind of chaotic, absurd voice he developed.
That's the real core of it, isn't it? How the personal stuff feeds the professional. So, okay, our mission for you, listening in, is to really follow this evolution. We're going to track Glass from, being this young guy starting out in Philly to where he is now, this veteran comic with this super unique podcast known for being incredibly honest. And we're going to stick to the facts, the dates, the names, everything the sources give us to really paint the full picture of how being transparent kind of transformed his comedy.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, the origin story. Because like we said, 40 plus years doing stand-up, that's incredible endurance.
It really is.
Todd Stephen Glass, born December 16th, 1964, Philadelphia suburbs.
And the key thing here is how early he started. It wasn't like a post-college thing. The material shows he was doing stand-up professionally in Philadelphia back in 1982. He was still in high school, Conestoga High School.
Wow, okay, stand-up in high school, that's intense.
Think about it, right? Stand-up demands so much confidence, quick thinking. Doing that while you're navigating, high school, it's got to shape you differently. You're immersed in that world so young. It builds technique, sure, but also just a unique perspective compared to someone starting later.
Yeah, you can see how that might lead to a style that's hard to pin down. The sources list his genres.
Yeah.
Okay, observational, lots of comics do that, but then it jumps straight into surreal humor, alternative comedy, and absurdism.
Exactly. It's not just set up punchline.
No.
And what's interesting is how he uses that absurdity. He's talking about stuff we all recognize, American culture, pop culture, weird human behavior, everyday life. But it's all filtered through this really nonlinear, strange lens. Lots of self-deprecation in there too. High energy tangents.
Impersonations.
Oh, the impersonations, yeah.
Okay.
Often it's totally bizarre. It's like it starts grounded, but then it just goes way off the rails, He messes with your expectations of where a joke is going. That controlled chaos, that pure alternate comedy.
And you see that mix early on in his career, visibility.
Yeah.
Late 80s, he's on A&E's An Evening at the Improv.
Right, which was huge back then.
Mm-hmm.
A very mainstream, traditional stand-up show, big exposure. Clearly, he can work that room, play by those rules.
But then pretty much right after early 90s, he starts showing up on Comedy Central.
Mm-hmm. Which was just starting to become the place for edgier, less networky comedy. So he's succeeding in both the old school club system, like the Improv, and on this new cable frontier almost at the same time. That shows serious adaptability. He could make his unique voice work in different formats.
Speaking of that unique voice, the sources mention two personal things that might feed into it, especially the surreal, nonlinear stuff. He's Jewish and he's dyslexic.
Okay, let's unpack that. The dyslexia connection first, maybe. Dyslexia often involves processing information, language, sequences in a different way, right? Not always linear. So if you apply that kind of thinking to stand-up comedy, it can come out as deliberately messing with traditional timing or structure. Instead of A leads to B leads to C. Maybe he uses repetition or flies off on a tangent or does these sharp character shifts that don't follow normal logic.
So the way his brain works might actually be the engine for the absurdity?
It seems plausible, yeah. It could turn what some might see as a challenge into a unique artistic strength.
Yeah.
It's a different wiring that fits perfectly with surreal comedy.
That's fascinating. The thinking is the style.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
And then you layer the Jewish cultural background on top. There are strong traditions in Jewish humor around storytelling, wordplay, fast timing, deep observation. Often with self-deprecation and commentary on fitting in or not fitting in.
So that adds another layer of influence.
Definitely. It gives him another whole tradition to draw from. So you've got maybe dyslexia influencing the form, the chaos, the structure, and his heritage influencing the content, the pacing, the specific kind of self-deprecation he uses when talking about, say, pop culture. It makes his absurdism feel very specific to him. It's not just random noise, it's structured, personal chaos.
Okay, so he's honing this style, this kind of structured chaos. And then segment 2, this is where he really breaks into wider consciousness through TV, mapping out that mainstream footprint. And ironically, the biggest splash maybe comes from reality TV.
Yeah, it's a funny contrast, right?
Yeah.
His broadest exposure probably came from being a contestant on NBC's Last Comic Standing. He was on 2 seasons, actually seasons 2 and 3.
Right, alongside some big names came out of those seasons.
Absolutely. People like Amy Schumer, Gabriel Iglesias were on those seasons too. Being on a highly rated network show like that put his, let's say, unconventional style in front of millions who maybe weren't hanging out in old comedy clubs.
But he wasn't just a reality contestant. He was also a fixture on Late Night, a reliable guest. You see him frequently on Jimmy Kimmel Live, Late Night with Conan O'Brien.
Yeah, being a regular, trusted face on those big network shows, that's a sign of a real working pro, someone who can deliver consistently. It separates the club comics from the established veterans.
And it's important what kind of shows he was doing, too. It wasn't just light chat.
Exactly. While he's doing Kimmel and Conan, he's also deep in the more critical and political comedy shows. He was a regular on Tough Crowd with Colin Quinn.
Which was a very specific format, that roundtable debate style.
Very specific. And he popped up on the Dennis Miller Show, Politically Incorrect. These shows needed sharp, fast, often political points. It shows he could switch from, like, physical absurdity to quick-witted commentary.
Wait, hold on. Being a regular on Politically Incorrect and also being a key part of the alt-comedy scene, how does that work? Those feel like different worlds. How did his surreal stuff fit into, like, a political debate?
I think it points to the intelligence behind the chaos.
Yeah.
You know? On those panels, maybe the delivery was more contained, but the content still had that absurd edge, like taking a political idea and pushing it to some ridiculous extreme.
Okay.
And crucially, even while getting that mainstream and political exposure, he stayed connected to the real alternative scene. He did spots on shows that were defining that whole movement. We're talking Louis, Tosh.0, and the absolute cornerstone, Mr. Show with Bob and David.
Okay, Mr. Show.
Yeah.
We need to pause on that. For anyone listening who doesn't know, why is appearing on Mr. Show such a big deal for alt-comedy cred?
Mr. Show was.
Yeah.
It was basically the ground zero for that late 90s, early 2000s wave of smart, postmodern, anti-establishment sketch comedy. It threw out traditional structures, punchlines. It was all link sketches, super surreal, really fast-paced. So for a comedian like Glass, whose own stand-up is built on absurdity and surrealism, being on that show means you were accepted, respected by the guys, Bob Odenkirk and David Cross, who were basically defining that whole sensibility. Being able to navigate between politically incorrect panels, Conan's couch, and a show like Mr. Show, that's incredibly rare. It shows his range and credibility across the whole spectrum.
And solidifying that early career, he gets his own Comedy Central Presents special pretty early on, back in 2001. That's the network saying, okay, we get this guy, this unique voice.
Yeah, and that same year, 2001, he drops his first stand-up album, Vintage Todd Glass and Other Craps.
Love that title.
It's perfect, right? So self-deprecating, totally leans into his humor, admits maybe not every bit's a diamond. But there's another key thing from around that time, too, placing him right in the heart of the L.A. alt scene.
You mean the Comedy Death Ray compilation?
Exactly. The sources mentioned he was featured on the Comedy Death Ray 2 CD set. And this wasn't just some random mixtape. This is a curated album featuring comics performing in the Comedy Death Ray showcase.
At the UCB Theater.
At the Upright Citizens Brigade Theater in L.A., which, as you know, wasn't just a venue. It was the absolute incubator for modern alternative comedy on the West Coast.
Yeah, UCB was ground zero.
Totally. That specific night, Comedy Death Ray, run by Scott Aukerman and B.J. Porter, it basically shaped the aesthetic and launched the careers of a whole generation of comics who broke away from the mainstream. Think comedy, bang, bang, and all that followed. Being on that compilation, CD puts Glass right in the middle of that hugely influential UCB scene in the mid-2000s. He was a bridge figure, comfortable in traditional clubs, but also right there at the start of this new, chaotic, long-form thing.
He was there, and then a bit later, 2009, he releases another album, Thin Pig, July 7th, 2009, on Comedy Central Records. So you see this progression, the specials, the albums in 01, 09, the TV work. He's building steadily, clearly wanting more creative room, more time.
Which leads perfectly into the next phase, segment 3, the format that could finally contain him, podcasting.
Yeah, the move into audio. This is where he really carves out his own unique space, right?
Absolutely. The podcast format just seems tailor-made for a comic mind that works in tangents, that thrives on collaboration and, well, chaos. It lets him be non-linear in a way a tight 5 on TV never could.
But he didn't jump straight into his own show. There was an earlier podcast first.
Right. He dipped his toe in the water with comedy.
Yeah.
And everything else. He co-hosted that one with Jimmy Dore and Stefani Zamorano. You can see that as like his lab, a place to figure out how sustained conversation, how tangents work in audio without the pressure of TV time limits or a live club audience expecting punchlines every few seconds.
But he didn't stick with it for too long.
No, he left that show in September 2009. They officially announced his departure on the November 20th episode that year. But, importantly, the sources note he came back later as a guest multiple times.
Oh, okay. So it wasn't like a bad breakup.
Doesn't sound like it. More like he realized he needed his own vehicle, full creative control, to do what he really wanted to do.
Which brings us to The Todd Glass Show. Debuts August 2011 on the Nerdist Network. And this is where things get really different, really specific to him.
Yeah, this is his definitive statement in the format. Because it wasn't just him chatting with a guest. It embraced the chaos, the surrealism of his stand-up, but used the technology, the format itself, to make it even more pronounced.
And the key is the structure, right? It's not just Todd. It's this ensemble, a regular crew, guests who are in on the joke, technical people who are part of the comedy itself.
We have to break down this crew and structure because it's what makes the show unique. It's not like any other comedy podcast, really. It's like structured, produced absurdity, and the production team are essentially co-performers.
So who are the key players in this community?
Okay, so you have the regular comedian collaborators who'd often be there, people like Rory Scovel, Rory's wife Jordan, Blake Wexler. They're jumping in on the bits, the tangents, the characters, but the real genius, the structural innovation, is bringing the technical crew into the comedy in real time.
Making the engineers and musicians part of the act.
Exactly. So you've got the audio engineers, Katie Levine and Aristotle Acevedo, who everyone calls Jet Ski. Their job isn't just to make it sound good. It's to react comedically. They're dropping in sound effects, music cues, weird noises, often totally unexpectedly, to heighten the moment or just derail things completely. It's integral to the show's feel.
And the musicians, too, Lynn Shore and Joe McKenzie, the sources specifically say they write and perform the show's jingles and audio cues. Why is that detail so defining?
Because it makes the podcast feel live, almost like interactive theater. Someone mentions a funny concept or Todd has an outburst, and boom, the musicians might create and perform a little song or jingle about it right there on the spot, sometimes satirical, sometimes just perfectly capturing the weirdness of the moment.
Instant musical commentary.
Yeah, that kind of immediate required musical integration. You just don't hear that on other comedy podcasts. It's the audio version of his chaotic stand-up style, blown up into this long-form, constantly shifting, self-referential soundscape.
It's using production itself as a comedic tool. Takes real commitment, real spontaneity, but also high technical skill to pull off. So this show, starting in 2011, becomes this anchor for him. He's still touring, still recording, but he has this continuous outlet that perfectly fits his voice, built around this specific community.
Exactly. And having that platform, that community, that connection with the audience, it gives him the space for what comes next. Segment 4, moving from just being a funny guy to being this incredibly public truth teller, things he could never really explore in a 5-minute spot on. Kimmel found a home here.
Okay, segment 4. This is where we shift focus to these two huge life-changing things that Todd Glass shared very publicly. And these moments really changed the perception, right? From just a comedian to someone showing incredible bravery, connecting his stage life to his real, vulnerable self, often for a reason beyond himself.
And the first one, the health scare, it happened right in the middle of things while he was working, which is just terrifying. April 16th, 2010, he collapses backstage at Largo.
The club in L.A.
Yeah, the famous Largo in L.A. Right after performing, apparently. Suffered a heart attack. Not at home, not quietly, literally his workplace, moments after being on stage.
And the sources are clear. It was serious. 100% blockage in his arteries. Had to have an angioplasty right away.
Yeah. And what's just astounding is how quickly and how openly he talked about it. Just 9 days later, he's on the Bonnie Hunt show talking about this brush with death. 9 days.
That's incredibly fast and incredibly candid.
It really is, especially given how severe it was. 100% blockage is no joke. And he didn't just share the event, he shared the why. He was very upfront, attributing it to, quote, bad genetics.
Right. He talked about his family history.
Yeah, so his dad had his first heart attack at only 30 and died from another one at 46.
Yeah.
So by giving that context, he framed his own crisis not as like a personal failing, but almost as this genetic destiny he had to confront.
And it wasn't just a one-off mention. He kept talking about it, updating people on his recovery, showing the ongoing effort involved. Like when he was on the Adam Carolla show, was it December 2012, a couple of years after the attack, he gave specifics.
Yeah, this is where we get the real details of the lifestyle change.
Yeah.
He said he'd lost 30 pounds by then, which takes sustained effort. He talked about quitting smoking, clarifying he'd been a pack-a-month smoker before, which adds a bit of color, right?
Yeah.
And because of the genetics, he started taking Liptibor to manage the risk. Giving those details, it paints a picture of responsible, long-term management, not just the initial drama. It's about the daily work of staying healthy after something like that.
So this theme of public vulnerability, starting with this really serious physical crisis linked to genetics, it kind of sets the stage for the second big disclosure, one that was maybe less about fate and more about personal choice and social conscience, coming out publicly.
Right, and the timing and the platform for that are really key. Yeah. He chose WTF with Mark Maron, episode 245, January 16th, 2012.
Which, by then, WTF was the place for comedians to get really honest, right?
Absolutely. It was known for these deep, often raw conversations about careers, struggles, trauma. It offered this sort of safe space, but with a massive, engaged audience, perfect for something this significant.
And the sources say, look, his friends, his family, they knew he was gay, but telling the world publicly was a big step professionally and personally. But it's the reason he gave that's so powerful.
Yeah, it wasn't just about him. He explicitly said he'd been worried about coming out publicly, but the recent wave of suicides among LGBT youth.
Yeah.
That's what pushed him to do it. That was his motivation.
Wow.
That detail is just crucial. He's linking his personal truth directly to a social cause, to potentially helping kids who are struggling. He saw his platform not just for jokes, but for visibility, for responsibility, maybe even saving lives.
So you have these two huge moments of vulnerability presented very differently. First, the heart attack in 2010, physical, life-threatening, attributed to bad genetics, kind of out of his control. Then 2 years later, coming out emotional, social, a deliberate choice made on a major platform, driven by a desire to address suffering.
It's a really powerful contrast. Discussing a near-death experience, sharing his identity, both show this incredible commitment to transparency. It shifted his public image, I think. He wasn't just a funny, chaotic guy anymore. He was using his platform to be radically human, connecting his own life to bigger social issues. And that vulnerability, weirdly, probably made his comedy stronger, deeper. It grounded the absurdity in something very real.
Yeah, it adds this whole other layer. The chaos on stage feels different when you know the chaos and the truth he's navigated off stage. It shows how comedy that starts absurd can end up being profoundly truthful, even a form of public service. Okay, so wrapping things up in segment 5, let's just quickly look at his output beyond the live stage and the podcast, confirming he's still writing, still recording, keeping that momentum going alongside all this transparency.
Yeah, looking at his albums, he didn't stop just because the podcast took off. After that 2009 Thin Pig album, he released Todd Glass Talks About Stuff in 2013. And then Todd Glass Act Happy came out in 2018.
So the podcast complements the stand-up. It doesn't replace it.
Exactly. He keeps the stage work going, that pure stand-up form, while the podcast is this whole other beast for the collaborative chaos.
But the big written piece is the book, right? Which seems to pull all these threads together, the absurdity, the career history, the personal honesty.
Right, the book, the Todd Glass situation, a bunch of lies about my personal life, and a bunch of true stories about my 30-year career in stand-up comedy. Even the title is Classic Glass, right?
Yeah, totally meta.
It acknowledges that whole blurry line in comedy between what's real and what's the act. The structure lies about personal life, true stories about career. It flips expectations, maybe suggesting that career was the place he felt safest, being honest in a weird way.
That came out in 2014 from Simon & Schuster. For anyone wanting to grab it, the ISBN is 978-14767-14417. And that publication date, 2014, is interesting. 2 years after he came out publicly. It seems like a time where he was really consolidating that candor across different forms.
So pulling it all together, the final picture. You've got this absolute veteran, performing since '82, still touring constantly, still putting out albums decades into his career. But he didn't just, survive this shift to new media. He built this incredibly unique, successful podcast community around his specific style, the chaos, the absurdity. And it's all underpinned now by this foundation of hard work and, more recently, this really remarkable personal honesty that took him from just being a great comic to being a really influential, important voice.
Yeah, it's not many comics who can talk about needing an angioplasty because of genetics and then also talk about why they came out publicly for social reasons and then maybe pivot to discussing a ridiculous jingle on their podcast, all with the same energy. The sources really give us the timeline, the details to see that whole arc, the longevity, the adaptability, and just the sheer guts involved. He used his platform not just for laughs, but for radical honesty.
Which brings us to a final thought, something for you, the listener, to chew on. Glass pins his heart attack, that 100% blockage, on bad genetics, something unavoidable, biological fate almost. But then he chose to share both that vulnerability and his identity as a gay man, the latter specifically for a social reason to help struggling kids.
Right. Fate versus choice.
Exactly. So it makes you wonder, right? Like, for any artist, anyone in the public eye, when does their biggest contribution stop being just the art itself, the laughs from the absurd jokes in his case, and become the specific, unvarnished truth they decide to share about themselves? And maybe even more interestingly, how does sharing that truth actually feed back into and strengthen the very absurd or surreal or chaotic art they were making all along? Does the honesty make the chaos ring truer?